The night Ethan Cole stopped pretending to be nobody, three armed men were already inside the building. He saw it before anyone else did. The way the security camera on floor 42 had been angled 2 degrees off its normal position. The way a visitor badge had been swiped twice in 4 minutes by someone who never came back down. The way Sophia Monroe's assistant had left the building pale-faced and walking too fast. Ethan pushed his cleaning cart past the elevator bay and said nothing. He always said nothing. That was the problem, and tonight it was going to get someone killed. Before we go further, if you're watching this and you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Every week we bring you stories like this one, ordinary people caught in extraordinary situations, making impossible choices, and fighting to protect the people they love. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss a single episode. And if this story already has you hooked, drop a like and leave a comment telling us what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. The janitorial cart had a broken wheel. It had been broken for 6 weeks, and Ethan Cole had put in the maintenance request twice, and both times nothing happened, and now every night he pushed the thing down the marble corridor of the 38th floor and listened to it drag and click, like a metronome counting out the hours of a life he'd chosen on purpose. He didn't mind the noise. He minded very little these days, which was either a sign of peace or a sign of something he didn't want to examine too closely. It was 11:14 on a Tuesday night. Monroe Dynamics occupied floors 20 through 45 of a glass tower in downtown Chicago, and at this hour the building was mostly empty. A few lights burned in the executive suites. The cleaning crew had split off by floor. Ethan had 38 through 40, solo, which was how he preferred it. Less conversation, less performance, less of whatever it was that other people required from him when they were in the same room. He sprayed down the glass partition outside the VP cluster and wiped it in long strokes, watching his own reflection disappear and reappear with each pass. 37 years old, 6 feet 1, dark circles under gray eyes that hadn't fully rested since 2019. He'd put on maybe 15 pounds since leaving the service. Not fat, just the soft weight that comes when you stop running 8 miles before breakfast because there's no one left to run from. And his hair had grown out enough that it curled slightly over his collar, which his daughter Lily said made him look like a slightly tired movie star, and which Ethan said made him look like he needed a haircut. He finished the partition and moved to the next one. He liked this job for exactly the reasons most people would have hated it. It was invisible. It was repetitive. It asked nothing of him except to show up, do the work, and go home. Nobody needed him to give a briefing or make a call or hold a perimeter. Nobody looked at him when he walked down the hall. He was furniture. He was background. He was the guy who made sure the executive bathroom smelled like eucalyptus. He had engineered his own disappearance, and he was good at it. The elevator dinged at the end of the corridor. Ethan didn't turn around immediately. He finished his stroke on the glass, let the sound register. Single passenger, stepped off heading left, medium heel strike, no luggage, paced slightly faster than casual, and then turned around in the natural rhythm of someone repositioning his cart. Sophia Monroe was walking toward her office carrying a leather portfolio and a coffee cup that had definitely gone cold 2 hours ago. She had her phone tucked between her shoulder and her ear and was saying something clipped and quiet that he couldn't fully hear. She wore a charcoal blazer over a white shirt, and her hair was down, which was unusual. Ethan had worked this building for 14 months, and he'd almost never seen her with her hair down after 9 p.m. She looked, if he was being honest about it, like someone who had received news they were still deciding whether to believe. She didn't look at him as she passed. He moved his cart to give her clearance. "No," she said into the phone, voice dropping. "I'm not talking about this over a call, Derek. I need you in the building tomorrow morning, 7:30. A pause. "I don't care. Be here." She pushed into her office without slowing down, and the door swung shut behind her, and Ethan went back to cleaning glass. He had noticed Sophia Monroe the way he noticed everything in the building, not because he was interested in her specifically, but because his brain categorized and filed people automatically, like a function he couldn't switch off. He'd tried. The switch just wasn't there. She was 30 years old. She'd taken over Monroe Dynamics 3 years earlier when her father, Raymond Monroe, had stepped back from operations following a series of health issues. The company ran mid-size medical technology projects, diagnostic equipment, hospital data systems, a developing AI-assisted triage platform that had gotten some industry coverage earlier in the year. Ethan knew this because he read the trade publications that got left in the recycling bins on the executive floors, and because information was something his brain collected whether he wanted it to or not. Sophia was sharp. He could tell that without needing to read anything. The way she moved through a room, the way her staff changed posture when she approached, the specific quality of silence that fell over a floor when she was working late. These were things Ethan registered and logged and mostly tried to ignore. She was his employer in the abstract sense. He was her janitor in the most literal sense. That was the whole relationship. That was all it needed to be. He pushed his cart toward the supply closet at the end of the hall and thought about Lily. His daughter was 9 years old and currently in the care of Mrs. Paulina Grzeski, their next-door neighbor, who was 72 and watched 3 hours of Polish soap operas every evening and kept a jar of hard butterscotch candies on the kitchen counter that Lily treated like currency. Ethan paid Paulina $200 a week, which Paulina accepted with mild protest and then spent entirely on butterscotch and bird feeders. It was a functional arrangement. Lily liked her. Paulina liked Lily. Ethan trusted Paulina in the specific, practical way he trusted anything. She was consistent, she was present, and she had never given him a reason to doubt her. He called every night at 10:30 before his break. Tonight, Lily had been half asleep already, and the call was mostly her telling him about a bird that had gotten into the school gymnasium during third period, and how her teacher, Mr. Okafor, had tried to catch it with a recycling bin and failed 3 times before it flew out a window on its own. She'd laughed telling it, that loose, unguarded laugh she had, the one that still caught him off guard sometimes, how fully it occupied a room, how little she held back. He'd sat in the stairwell on the 32nd floor with his back against cold concrete and listened to her laugh and said, "That poor bird," and she said no, the bird was fine, it was Mr. Okafor who needed help, and he said, "Fair point." After they hung up, he'd sat there for another 2 minutes before going back to work. He thought about her now in the supply closet, filling his mop bucket, the drag of the broken cartwheel, the eucalyptus spray. Lily's laugh. This was the life he had built, small, quiet, held together with routine. It was enough. Most nights, it was enough. At 12:45, he reached the 40th floor. This was the floor with the server cluster tucked behind the IT support wing. A mid-size room with badge-only access and a ceiling vent that hummed constantly. Ethan had cleaned this floor every Tuesday and Friday for 14 months. He knew its rhythms. He knew which lights stayed on overnight and which ones flickered when the HVAC cycled. He knew the cleaning closet key stuck slightly if you didn't lift the handle before turning, and that the water fountain at the north end ran about 4 degrees colder than the one near the elevator bank. He knew, therefore, that the corridor light outside the server room should not be on. It was on. He stopped the cart, stood there for a second. Just a man with a mop in a corridor at 12:45 in the morning, looking at a light that shouldn't be lit. He walked to the end of the hall. The badge reader outside the server room was dark. Not the usual green standby pulse, just dark, offline. He looked at the door, looked at the frame. The magnetic seal had not fully engaged, a gap, barely 2 millimeters, that wouldn't be visible to someone passing in a hurry. He did not open the door. He stood there and counted his breaths and listened. Somewhere inside the server room, someone was moving. The specific kind of moving that happens when someone is trying very hard not to make noise, which Ethan had learned in environments he no longer thought about if he could help it, was always louder than actual quiet. He counted to 8. The sound stopped. Then a very soft, very deliberate tap of fingers on a keyboard. He turned around and pushed his cart down the hall and did not look back. In the stairwell, he took out his phone and sat down on the top step. He wanted to call someone. He recognized the impulse, named it, and then sat with the question of who exactly he would call. The answer was more complicated than it should have been. He had a former colleague, Marcus Webb, who was now doing private security consulting in Atlanta. They talked maybe 4 times a year. He had a therapist he'd seen for 8 months after leaving the service, a calm, unhurried woman named Dr. Solis, who had eventually told him, with what seemed like genuine regret, that she couldn't help someone who wouldn't let her past the second layer. He had Lily. He did not have the kind of person you called at 12:50 in the morning because you found a server room door 2 millimeters open. He also did not have a job description that included corporate espionage. He put his phone away. He had no proof of anything. He had a light that was on and a door that wasn't closed, and the sound of someone who might have just been an IT tech doing late maintenance. These things happened. He was a janitor. He cleaned floors. He was not here to reconstruct threat patterns or run surveillance assessments. He was nobody. That was the whole point. He went back to work. But he started paying attention differently. He told himself it was passive, just noting. The way you note weather before you decide whether to bring a jacket. No commitment, just awareness. Over the following nights, he noted the following. The security camera on floor 40, positioned to cover the corridor between the server room and the east stairwell, had been rotated. Not broken, not removed, just rotated, subtly, so that its field of view now covered a blank stretch of wall instead of the door it was supposed to monitor. Whoever had done it knew exactly where the blind spot needed to be. A man Ethan had never seen before badged into the building at 2 a.m. on a Wednesday using a credential belonging, according to the badge panel display, to someone named T. Farrell. Ethan had seen T. Farrell, a middle-aged IT manager with a Giants cap and a habit of leaving his lunch containers in the wrong cabinet, in the building dozens of times. T. Farrell was not in the building at 2 a.m. on a Wednesday. On Thursday, a second unfamiliar man appeared. Different build, different entry point, the parking level where badge tracking was lighter. He carried a bag that was sized for equipment and walked with the careful, even pace of someone who had done whatever they were about to do many times before. Ethan watched these things and said nothing to anyone and pushed his cart down corridors that smelled like eucalyptus. And at 10:30 every night he called Lily, and she told him about school and birds and whatever catastrophe had befallen Mr. Okafor that day, and he sat in stairwells and listened. He told himself he was not getting involved. He was very, very good at telling himself things. On the Friday of that week, he was finishing the floor 40 corridor at around 1:15 when he heard raised voices from the direction of the executive conference suite. Not loud, not the kind of raise that carries, the kind that's been deliberately kept low, but has lost some of its control at the edges. He moved his cart slowly. This was what he did. He moved his cart slowly, and he was invisible, and invisible things could go places. He positioned himself near the recycling station across from the suite's glass wall and crouched to retrieve a trash liner. From this angle, through the frosted glass, he could make out 2 figures. One was Sophia Monroe. The silhouette was unmistakable. The posture especially, the way she stood when she was angry, weight shifted slightly forward, like she was considering something and not enjoying the consideration. The other figure was larger, a man standing with his hands in his jacket pockets, his head at a slight tilt. Victor Hale, the company's executive vice president. Ethan had seen him in the building regularly. Polished, soft-spoken, in the way that some people are soft-spoken as a strategy. The kind of man who made you feel like he was doing you a favor by listening to you. Ethan had no specific evidence that Victor Hale was a bad person. He also had no warmth for him, which wasn't evidence either. He couldn't make out the words. He got fragments. Sophia's voice, sharp, not your call. Then Victor's, measured, temporary arrangement, and something else, quieter. Then Sophia again. Get out of my office. Victor left through the side door. He walked at an easy pace, hands still in his jacket pockets, head still at that slight tilt. He paused once near the elevator bay and checked something on his phone. He was smiling at his phone, the kind of smile that doesn't need an audience. Ethan stayed where he was until the elevator closed behind Victor Hale. Then he straightened up, tied off the trash liner, dropped it in the cart, and pushed on down the corridor. His heart was steady. His hands were steady. The broken wheel dragged and clicked. Inside his chest, something old and quiet and unhappy had woken up. He pushed the cart all the way to the service elevator, rode it down to the loading dock, wheeled out the trash, came back up. He did everything in its correct sequence. He was methodical. He was calm. He finished his shift at 3:15 and changed out of his uniform in the locker room and walked out into the cold Chicago morning and got into his 10-year-old Civic and drove home. Lily was asleep. He checked on her. She was curled on her side with her hand tucked under her cheek, her breathing slow and even. He sat in the kitchen for a long time after that, in the dark, with a glass of water he didn't drink. The smile on Victor Hale's face, the rotated camera, the offline badge reader, the careful, even footsteps of a man who had done this before. Ethan Cole was nobody. He cleaned floors. He had spent 4 years building a life that asked nothing of him except to be present for his daughter, to be consistent, to be ordinary. He was very good at ordinary. He sat in his kitchen in the dark and reminded himself of that. And somewhere in the back of his mind, in a room he kept locked and rarely visited, something he thought he'd buried for good was pulling at the door. 3 days after the conversation she'd had with Victor in the conference suite, the one where she'd told him to get out of her office and meant it more completely than she had ever meant anything, Sophia Monroe sat at her desk at 6:40 in the morning and stared at a spreadsheet that made no sense. She had been awake since 4, not the useful kind of awake where you rise early and get things done and feel righteous about it. The other kind. The kind where your eyes open in the dark and your brain is already running at full speed and there is absolutely nothing you can do about it except lie there and wait for enough light to justify getting up. She'd been in the office by 5:15, made her own coffee because nobody else was there yet, sat at her desk and pulled up the financial records for the Helix project, Monroe Dynamics AI-assisted triage platform, the one that had taken 2 years and roughly $40 million to develop, and was 18 months from a rollout that would put their diagnostic software into hospital networks across 7 states. The Helix project was the most important thing the company had ever built. It was also, apparently, leaking. She'd found it by accident 3 weeks earlier, except a line item in a vendor payment summary that didn't match any contract she'd authorized. $42,000 paid to a consulting firm called Crestline Analytics. She'd pulled the contract. It didn't exist. She'd asked her CFO, a careful, bespectacled man named Gerald Park, about it. Gerald had gone pale in the specific way that people go pale when they are not personally responsible for something but can already see what it means. Since then, Sophia had found 11 more payments to Crestline Analytics. The smallest was $19,000. The largest was $230,000. Total, across 14 months, just over $1.4 million, paid out in increments small enough to stay below the threshold that would have triggered an automatic audit flag. Someone had known exactly where that threshold was. She had not gone to the board yet. She had not gone to legal yet. She had not told anyone except Gerald and her head of internal audit, a woman named Priya Nair, who had the disposition of someone who had been expecting exactly this kind of news and was simply relieved it had finally arrived. Priya had spent 10 days quietly tracing the payment authorization chain, and what she found was that every single Crestline payment had been approved through a secondary executive channel that bypassed Sophia's office entirely. The channel required VP-level credentials. Victor Hale held VP-level credentials. Sophia had known Victor for 6 years. He'd been with the company before she took over, one of her father's appointments. A man who wore good suits and gave smooth presentations, and had, in Sophia's experience, never once said anything that surprised her. She'd kept him on partly because he was competent, and partly because removing your father's people in your first year sends a particular message that she hadn't wanted to send. She'd worked with him, trusted him with operational decisions, sat across from him in hundreds of meetings. She had never liked him. She recognized now that she'd filed that discomfort under personal preference and moved on, which was either practical or naive, and she wasn't sure which. She pulled up a second window on her monitor and looked at the Helix technical files, the architecture documents, the development logs, the external consultant records. 3 months ago, someone had accessed the core algorithm files outside of normal business hours. The access log showed a credentialed user, internal. The credential belonged to a software engineer named Danny Cho, who was currently on paternity leave in Portland and had, when Priya quietly reached out through an intermediary, no idea his credentials had been used. Someone had borrowed Danny Cho's login. Someone had copied the Helix core files. Sophia sat back in her chair and rubbed her eyes with the heels of her hands and thought about what this meant in practical terms. It meant that the most valuable piece of intellectual property her company had ever produced had potentially been extracted and sold to a competitor, or was in the process of being sold, or was being held as leverage for something she hadn't figured out yet. It meant that 14 months of payments had been flowing out of her company to an entity that, as far as Priya could determine, had no verifiable office address, no registered employees, and no public record of any consulting work whatsoever. It meant that Victor Hale had, in all likelihood, been doing this for over a year while she sat across from him in board meetings and signed off on his performance reviews. Her coffee had gone cold. She got up and poured it down the sink and stood at the window with her arms crossed and looked out at the city, which was still gray and half dark at that hour, the lake invisible somewhere to the east, the streets below just beginning to collect the first commuters. She thought about her father. Raymond Monroe had built this company over 30 years, and he'd handed it to her when he was too sick to keep running it himself, and the last thing he'd said to her in any meaningful way, not the medical logistics conversations, not the board transition paperwork, but the actual last real thing he'd said, was, "Don't let them make small decisions for you." She hadn't fully understood what he meant at the time. She was starting to. She confronted Victor that same afternoon. She had debated waiting. Priya had counseled patience, more documentation, a cleaner paper trail, legal counsel present. Gerald had said almost nothing, which with Gerald meant he thought waiting was also the right call, but didn't want to be the one to say so. Sophia had listened to all of this, and then at 3:45 she'd walked down to Victor's office on the 39th floor and knocked twice and opened the door. Victor was on a call. He held up one finger, the kind of gesture that, depending on context, could be one moment or you're interrupting something important. Sophia sat down in the chair across from his desk and waited. She looked at the framed photographs on his credenza, a boat somewhere, a ski slope, what looked like a charity gala where he was shaking hands with a local politician whose name she couldn't place, and waited. He finished the call and set his phone down and looked at her with the pleasant, neutral expression she'd seen on his face 10,000 times. "Sophia, I was going to come find you later. I have some thoughts on the Q3 projections we should—" "I know about Crestline Analytics," she said. The neutral expression stayed where it was for about 3 seconds. Then something moved under it, very slightly, the way ice shifts when the water below it is warmer than it looks. "That's a vendor relationship I've been managing," he said. "It's been— Victor." She said his name the way you say something when you want it to land without decoration. "There are no contracts. There's no deliverables documentation. There's no record of any services rendered. $1.4 million over 14 months, and I cannot find a single piece of paper that tells me what we got for it." He was quiet for a moment. He leaned back in his chair slightly, not defensive exactly, more like someone recalibrating. "It's a complex arrangement," he said, "structured for competitive sensitivity. I was planning to bring it to you for formalization once we—" "Stop!" She held up her hand. "I don't want the explanation you've been sitting on. I want the truth, and I want it right now. And I want you to understand that I have already been to legal, and they are already looking at this. So whatever you're about to say it like someone who understands what's coming." That last part was not entirely true. She hadn't been to legal yet. But she'd found, over 3 years of running this company, that sometimes the truth is less useful than what people believe about the truth. And she wanted to see what happened to his face. What happened was nothing. That was the thing that unsettled her later, when she replayed the conversation. His face didn't do what she expected it to do. There was no panic, no scrambling. He just looked at her for a moment with that same measured, almost thoughtful expression, and then he said, "I think you should consider the position you're in." "Excuse me." "The company is at an inflection point," he said. His voice had dropped slightly, not threatening, almost gentle, which was worse. "The Helix rollout is 18 months out, and the capital requirements for that launch are significant. The board is going to want stability. A CEO who is internally focused on a legal dispute who may be about to generate significant negative attention, that's a liability. I have relationships with 3 board members who have real concerns about the pace of development. I'm not saying this to alarm you. I'm saying it because I think there's a path here that doesn't have to be adversarial. Sophia stared at him. You want me to walk away? She said. That's what you're saying. I'm saying there are structures we could put in place that would protect your legacy here while allowing, this is my company. The words came out very quiet. She hadn't intended to say it quietly. That was just what happened. I built this. My family built this. You have been sitting at this desk in this office that I kept for you because I thought you were someone worth keeping. And you have been... She stopped because she had almost said something that she hadn't confirmed yet, and she was not going to give him anything he didn't already know. We're done talking, she said. She stood up. Don't access any company systems outside of your normal authorization until I tell you otherwise. Don't have any conversations about Helix with external parties. And Victor? She picked up her portfolio from the chair. Don't smile at your phone in my hallway. She left before he could answer Schatz. She didn't notice the janitor until she was almost back to the elevator. He was at the far end of the corridor, crouched beside his cart, collecting a trash liner from the recycling station. He didn't look up as she passed. Medium height, dark hair going slightly shaggy at the collar, the kind of face that settled naturally into a neutral expression. She'd seen him before, she was almost certain. The night crew, she thought, though she couldn't have said exactly which floors he covered or how long he'd been with the company. She was aware, in the abstract way she was aware of many things about how the building ran, that she had never learned his name. She hit the elevator button and waited. Behind her, the cart's wheel made a dragging, clicking sound as the janitor moved it toward the next station. The elevator came. She got in. The doors closed. She was thinking about Victor's hands, how they'd stayed perfectly still on the desk the entire time, no fidgeting, no nervous energy, which wasn't calm so much as it was practiced. And she almost missed the floor button and had to hit it twice. Ethan had heard enough. He was getting better at positioning the cart. Near a recycling station, he could spend 4 minutes collecting liners and produce no sound more suspicious than the routine compression of a trash bag, and from that position, near the corridor junction on 39, slightly east of the executive cluster, the ventilation design of the floor meant that voices carried in ways the architects almost certainly hadn't planned for. He hadn't heard everything. He'd heard enough. I know about Crestline Analytics. And then later, Sophia's voice going quiet in a way that was not weakness. The specific quiet of someone who is choosing not to say a thing they could say, which takes more control than most people understand. Don't smile at your phone in my hallway. He'd wanted, briefly and irrationally, to tell her that he'd seen it, the smile, that she was right to notice it, that the smile was the thing that mattered more than the words, that a man who smiles like that at his phone while walking away from a confrontation is a man who believes the outcome is already decided. He hadn't said anything. He never said anything. He finished the recycling station and pushed the cart toward the north corridor. What he was thinking about was the pattern, not just Crestline, not just the financial irregularities that were clearly the visible surface of something bigger. He was thinking about the camera on floor 40, the offline badge reader. The 2 men he'd seen enter the building in the middle of the night using borrowed credentials, the bag that was sized for equipment, the careful, even footsteps. Someone had been inside the company's systems. Someone had taken something. And Victor Hale, whether he was running this himself or was a mid-level piece of a larger operation, had just tried to convince Sophia Monroe to step away from her own company rather than fight it. The fact that he'd tried that first before anything escalated meant one of 2 things. Either he was more cautious than Ethan had assessed, or he was buying time. Ethan didn't love either option. He took the service elevator to 40 and stood in it for a moment after the doors opened, just breathing. He was doing it again. The thing he'd done in kitchens and stairwells and parking structures for 4 years, rebuilding threat assessments out of ambient information, constructing operational pictures from fragments. He didn't want to be doing it. He was aware that he didn't want to be doing it and was doing it anyway, which was its own kind of answer to a question he hadn't asked. He got out of the elevator and started on the floor. The following week was quiet in a way that made him more attentive, not less. Victor Hale came and went as normal. He attended meetings. He ate lunch in the executive dining room on the 36th floor. He responded to emails. Ethan could tell when someone was in active email correspondence by the rhythm of their keyboard, and Victor's keyboard had a particular pattern. Bursts of fast typing, then long pauses, then a single keystroke that was probably send. He looked, to all appearances, like a man who had said his piece and was waiting for the world to catch up with the logic of his position. Sophia looked like someone carrying weight she wasn't distributing. Ethan watched her the way he watched everything. Not intently, not obviously, but consistently. She was working longer hours than usual. Her light was on when he arrived at 11 and on when he left at 3:15. She'd started taking the stairs instead of the elevator, which might have been exercise and might have been something else entirely. The instinct to use routes that are harder to observe. She looked tired. She looked careful. And once, coming around the corner of the 38th floor corridor at 11:40 on a Thursday, she nearly walked into his cart, stopped short, and said, "Sorry, I wasn't," and then looked at him in a way that was fractionally different from how she'd looked at him every other time, which was to say she actually looked at him, the specific person, rather than through the general idea of a person who happened to be in her way. "No problem," Ethan said. She nodded and kept moving. He stood there for a second longer than was strictly necessary and then went back to work. On the second Thursday, the man with the equipment bag came back. This time he wasn't alone. He came in through the parking level at 1:17 a.m. with a second man, different from the one Ethan had seen before, shorter, wearing a jacket that was slightly too warm for the weather, and they split off at the stairwell door. The shorter one headed toward the east wing. The first man went up. Ethan had been on his break on 32, sitting in the stairwell, when he heard the door on the level below open and close. He waited, counted, heard footsteps on the stairs. Not 31, not 33. Continuing up, he stayed perfectly still and listened to the footsteps pass the landing below him and keep going. 40. They were going to 40. He gave them 90 seconds. Then he went up. He didn't have a plan. He told himself he was just going to look. He was good at just looking. He had a cart and a uniform and a reason to be on any floor at any hour. Nobody questions the janitor at 1 in the morning because nobody thinks about the janitor at 1 in the morning. He reached 40 and eased the stairwell door open 3 inches. The corridor lights were at their overnight setting, dimmed to about 40%. The server room door, which should have been closed and sealed, was open. Light from inside spilled in a thin line across the hallway floor. From inside, he could hear very quiet, very deliberate sounds. The soft zip of a bag. The double click of a device being connected. The faint mechanical sound of something spinning up. He was standing in the stairwell doorway on the 40th floor of a building where someone was actively copying proprietary medical technology, and he had a mop, and his daughter was asleep 3 miles away, and he had spent 4 years making himself into nobody. He let the stairwell door close softly. He took out his phone. He thought about who to call. He thought about this for longer than it should have taken him, and what kept surfacing, past the question of what his job description was, past the question of what he could prove, past the question of why any of this was his problem, was the image of Sophia Monroe in Victor Hale's office, standing up from her chair, her voice gone very quiet. "This is my company." He thought about what happens when someone tries to take a thing from a person who has spent everything they have building it. He thought about how that feels from the outside looking in, the particular helplessness of watching it happen and doing nothing. He had felt that before. He knew exactly what it cost. He didn't call anyone. He went back down to 38 and retrieved his cart and continued his shift. And he did not go back to 40, and he did not confront anyone. And at 3:15, he changed out of his uniform and went home. He checked on Lily. He sat in the kitchen. He didn't sleep. What he had decided, without exactly deciding it, the way you sometimes make choices before you consciously know you've made them, was that he was going to keep watching. That was all. Just watching. He was very practiced at lying to himself about what just watching actually meant. The call came on a Saturday. Not to him. He didn't have a role that received calls. But he was in the building on Saturday because he'd traded shifts with a coworker named Phil who had a cousin's wedding, and so Ethan was on the 39th floor at 2 in the afternoon when the executive suite buzzed with an energy that shouldn't have been there on a weekend. He heard it before he saw it. Footsteps. Multiple people, coordinated, not the casual scatter of weekend staff. 3 people from the direction of the elevator bay, 2 more from the north stairwell. 5 people total, converging on the executive conference suite from 2 directions, which was not how people moved to a meeting. That was how people moved to a destination they've already secured the perimeter around. Ethan was in the south supply closet when they passed. He held perfectly still. Through the door gap, a 1/4 inch, no more, he counted them. 3 men he'd never seen before, 2 in jackets that sat slightly wrong at the shoulder. One was the man who'd been in the server room, the other was the shorter one from the parking level, and between them, moving with the leashed urgency of someone who has stopped pretending to be patient, was Victor Hale. They went into the conference suite. 20 seconds later, Ethan heard a voice he recognized. Sophia Monroe, sharp and startled. "What is this?" "Victor, what?" And then the conference suite door closed. Ethan stood in the supply closet in the dark, hand on the door handle, not breathing. He counted to 5. Then he picked up his phone and looked at the screen. He was thinking about calling building security. He was thinking about calling 911. He was running the math on response time, on what could happen in 8 minutes while he waited, on what Sophia Monroe's voice had sounded like before the door closed. He put the phone in his pocket. He opened the supply closet door. He picked up his cart, and he pushed it down the hallway toward the conference suite, the broken wheel dragging and clicking on the marble floor, announcing himself to no one in particular, just a man doing his job on a Saturday afternoon, completely unremarkable, completely harmless, heading exactly where he needed to go. The conference suite at Monroe Dynamics occupied the northeast corner of the 39th floor, and its glass walls, frosted from the corridor side for privacy, ran floor to ceiling on 2 sides, which meant that from the right angle, standing at the right distance, you could see shapes through the glass without being able to make out faces. Ethan pushed his cart to the right angle and stood at the right distance. 5 shapes inside. Sophia's was the one standing slightly apart from the others, weight forward, the posture he recognized. Victor's was the one nearest the head of the table. The other 3 were positioned in a loose arc that wasn't accidental, 2 near the door, 1 near the windows. Basic containment geometry. He'd drawn rooms like this on dry erase boards in a previous life. He needed to understand what he was walking into. The conference suite had 2 entry points, the main door from the primary corridor and a secondary door on the south wall that connected to a small anteroom used for AV equipment and catering staging. The anteroom had its own access point from the service hallway, a plain door with a standard lever handle that was not badge restricted because it was considered a utility space. Ethan knew this because he'd cleaned it 40 times. He pushed his cart past the main corridor entrance without stopping, continued around the corner, and turned into the service hallway. The door to the anteroom was unlocked, as it almost always was on weekdays, and apparently on weekends too. He eased it open, moved inside, and let it close behind him without a sound. The anteroom was narrow, maybe 12 feet by 8, stacked on one side with folded tablecloths and a portable beverage station, on the other with a rack of AV cables and an ancient projector nobody used anymore. The south door, leading into the conference suite itself, was solid. No window, but the gap at the bottom was wide enough that sound came through with reasonable clarity. He crouched beside the door and listened. Victor's voice, even and unhurried, not asking you to make this harder than it needs to be. The document is straightforward. Temporary operational transfer of executive authority, with full compensation and a guaranteed seat on the advisory board. You walk away with your reputation intact. Sophia. My reputation is intact right now. You're the one who should be worried about your reputation. Sophia. A pause. We've been through the alternatives. Legal action takes time you don't have. The board will fracture the moment this becomes public. Your father's health is already... Don't. Her voice had gone to that very quiet place again. Don't say another word about my father. A different voice, one of the men Ethan hadn't heard before, lower, slightly accented, in a way he couldn't place from one sentence. Mr. Hale, we're behind schedule. I know. Victor again. Sophia, I've given you every reasonable option. At this point, the choice is yours, but I want you to understand there is a hard limit on how long I can keep this civil. Silence. 5 seconds. 8. Then Sophia. You brought armed men into my building to pressure me into signing a document. That's not a business negotiation, Victor. That's a crime. And the moment I'm out of this room, every one of you is going to find out exactly how that distinction plays out. Another voice, not the accented one, a third man. She's not going to sign. Victor, quietly. Give her a minute. Ethan stood up. He took stock of what he had. A mop handle, aluminum, detachable from the head, roughly 42 inches when separated. A spray bottle of industrial cleaner with enough pressure in the trigger to reach 8 feet. 3 rolls of heavy-duty trash liner bags, which were useless except as hand ties if he needed them. The portable beverage station, which was a stainless steel cart on casters and weighed, he estimated, about 60 pounds. He had the anteroom door, which opened inward, meaning he controlled when it opened. He had the element of surprise, which was real but would last approximately 2 seconds once it was spent. He had training that was 5 years old and a body that was carrying a desk job's worth of rust. He did not have a plan so much as a sequence. Do the first thing, create the condition for the second thing. Do that. Keep going. He unscrewed the mop head, set it against the wall, gripped the aluminum handle, positioned himself to the side of the door, not directly behind it, where the first thing anyone does is push back. He reached out and put his hand on the lever. Then he stopped. There were 5 people in that room. He was one person with a mop handle and a spray bottle. He was 37 years old and hadn't thrown a punch in anger since a bar in Raleigh in 2020 that he didn't like to think about. 2 of the men were almost certainly armed. Victor Hale was not a physical threat, but he was smart, and smart people in corners do unpredictable things. He thought about Lily. He thought about her for exactly 3 seconds. Not guiltily, not sentimentally, just factually, the way you check a compass. She was 3 miles away in a house with Mrs. Paulina Grzeski and a jar of butterscotch candy and 3 hours of Polish soap operas. She was fine. She would be fine regardless of what happened in the next few minutes because she was 9 years old and she was safe, and the choice being made in this hallway had nothing to do with her. He opened the door. He did not try to be quiet about it. Quiet entrances get people shot. Loud, purposeful, slightly annoying employee entrances get people confused, and confused people react half a second slower than they otherwise would, and half a second properly used is significant. He pushed the anteroom door open hard enough that it swung and hit the doorstop with a bang, and he came in pushing the beverage station ahead of him, both hands on the frame, leaning into it, like a man who had been told to move this thing and was annoyed about it. And he said, in the mildly irritated voice of someone whose job keeps interrupting his evening, Sorry, they said the setup for the 7:30. And then he stopped, looked around, did the face of someone who has walked into the wrong room, and said, Oh, is this not? I was told conference be... 3 seconds of pure confusion. Victor's face going from composed to irritated. The 2 men near the door exchanging a look. The third, near the windows, starting to move. The one near the windows was the one who'd been in the server room. Ethan had cataloged him from a distance on 2 separate nights. Compact, efficient, kept his right hand close to his body. Which meant right-handed, which meant the weapon, if there was one, was there. Ethan stopped performing the confused employee at the 2-second mark. The beverage station was already moving. He let go with his left hand, used his right to shove it hard toward the 2 men near the door. 60 pounds of stainless steel on casters crossed 12 feet of conference room floor in less time than it took either of them to fully register what was happening. And by the time the cart hit the nearer one in the hip and sent him sideways into his partner, Ethan was already past the table. He covered the distance to the window man in 4 steps. The man was fast, faster than the others, definitely had training, had his right hand moving toward his jacket, but he'd lost a half-second to the distraction and another half-second to recalibrating that this was not a confused janitor. And by the time his hand reached his jacket, Ethan was inside his arm, right hand controlling the wrist, left elbow finding the man's jaw with the leverage of someone who knew exactly where to put force and how much of it. The man's head snapped back. His knees went. Ethan took the weapon, a compact semi-automatic, safety still on, stepped back, and put it on the table away from everyone and kept moving. The two men by the door had sorted out the beverage cart. The nearer one was up and moving. The second was slower. He'd gone into the cart hard and was favoring his left side. Ethan met the first one at the midpoint of the room. This man was bigger, had reach on him, and led with a grab rather than a strike, which told Ethan he was security trained rather than combat trained. He let the grab connect, let the man's hand close on his collar, used the grip as an anchor point, and turned into him rather than away, close enough that the man's size became a liability instead of an asset, and put two short strikes into his midsection. And when the man's posture broke, stepped behind him and used his own momentum to put him into the edge of the conference table. The table was solid. The man went down and stayed down. The second one, still favoring his left side, had produced a zip tie from somewhere and was looking at Ethan with the expression of someone reassessing their evening. Ethan looked back at him, picked up the aluminum mop handle from where he'd set it against the wall on his way in, held it loosely. "You want to put that down," Ethan said. His voice came out even. He was breathing harder than he wanted to be. The man put it down. The one whose jaw he'd hit was still on the floor, conscious, but not in any hurry to get up. Victor Hale had not moved. He was standing at the head of the table with his hands on the back of a chair, and his face had done the thing Ethan had wanted to see it do. It had lost its composure, not dramatically, not theatrically, just enough that the practiced neutrality had slipped, and underneath it there was something that looked like the first edge of real fear. He was staring at Ethan with an expression that was almost entirely, "Who are you?" "Sophia," Ethan said without looking at her. "Is there a fourth person I should know about?" A beat. Then her voice, remarkably steady. "No. Just these three, and Victor." "Okay." Ethan kept his eyes on Victor. "There's a service stairwell through the south anteroom. Door at the end of the hall takes you to the parking level. I need you to go there right now and keep going down until you're outside the building. I'm not leaving you here I'm not asking you to wait for me. I'm asking you to be outside this building in the next 2 minutes." He finally looked at her. She was standing beside the table with her portfolio clutched against her chest and her hair slightly disheveled, and her expression doing 3 things at once in a way that didn't resolve into any single readable emotion. "Can you do that?" She looked at him for a moment. Not the way she'd looked at him in the corridor, not through him or past him, or in the general direction of a person-shaped object in her building. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. She went through the anteroom door. "Sit." Victor spoke before the door finished closing. "I know what you're doing," he said, and his voice had mostly recovered its evenness. "And I want you to understand that this accomplishes nothing. There are people outside this building. There are people who have copies of everything we've discussed. You can't." "I'm not trying to accomplish anything," Ethan said. "I'm a janitor. I walked into the wrong room." "Don't do that." "Do what?" "The humble routine. Whoever you are, whatever you were, the routine is done." Victor straightened up from the chair back. He had good posture. He had the kind of practiced physical control that comes from decades of managing how you appear in rooms. "You have 3 unconscious security contractors on my floor and a weapon on the table. You're not a janitor." "I clean floors 38 through 40, Ethan said. "I've worked here 14 months. I have a broken wheel on my cart that facilities still hasn't fixed." "What do you want?" "For you to stay in this room for the next 10 minutes. Victor tilted his head slightly. That gesture. "And if I don't?" Ethan said nothing. He picked up the weapon from the table and removed the magazine and set them separately and pushed both to the far end of the table. Then he leaned against the wall and looked at Victor Hale with the specific patience of someone who has waited in worse places for longer. Victor looked at the 3 men on the floor, looked at Ethan. Something in his expression did a small, reluctant calculation. He sat down. Ethan gave it 7 minutes before he left. Long enough for Sophia to be outside, long enough for whatever coordination Victor might have outside the building to be uncertain about what had happened and why their people weren't answering. He took the mop handle with him and left the weapon components on the table where they were. In the stairwell, going down, he let himself breathe. His right hand had a scrape across two knuckles from where it had caught the table edge during the second takedown. His shoulder ached in the specific way it had ached for 3 years from a dislocation that had healed imperfectly. He was sweating through his uniform. He descended 12 flights on autopilot, muscle memory doing the counting, his mind running the arithmetic of what had just happened and what it meant and what came next. What it meant was that Victor had escalated past financial maneuvering into direct physical coercion, which meant either he was more desperate than he'd been pretending, or someone above him, in whatever structure he was operating in, had decided the timeline needed compressing. What it meant for Sophia was that she was no longer dealing with an internal corruption problem. She was dealing with something that was willing to put armed men in a conference room on a Saturday afternoon. What it meant for Ethan was considerably more complicated, and he put that aside for the moment. He came out into the parking level and crossed to the exit ramp, and there was Sophia Monroe standing in the gray afternoon light on the sidewalk outside the building, still holding her portfolio, still looking like someone whose emotions were doing 3 things at once. A cab was idling about 20 feet away. She'd either called it or it was coincidence, and Ethan didn't believe much in coincidence. She saw him come out and something in her posture shifted. Not relief exactly, more like the specific release of a tension she'd been holding without realizing it. "You're limping," she said. "I'm not limping." "Your right leg. You favored it on the last step." He looked down at his leg. She was right. His knee had taken the edge of a chair at some point, and he hadn't registered it. "Old thing," he said. She stared at him. The cab sat there. Behind them, the building rose 45 floors into a gray Chicago Saturday, and somewhere on the 39th floor, Victor Hale was sitting in a conference room doing his own arithmetic. "Who are you?" Sophia said. It was almost the same question Victor had asked. It sounded completely different. "Ethan Cole," he said. "Nights, 38 through 40. "That's not what I mean." He knew what she meant. He looked at the sidewalk for a second, then back at her. "I know. Those men, you went through them like they were it." She stopped, started again. "I've had corporate security consultants who couldn't do what you just did. You went in there with a mop handle." "Beverage cart," he said. The mop handle was secondary. She stared at him. He wasn't sure if what he'd said was funny or not. He'd lost some calibration on that over the past few years. "I need to make some calls," she said. "I need to call legal, and I need to call the board chair, and I need to—" She pressed her fingers to her temple for a moment. "I need to know if those men are going to come out of that building. Not for a few minutes, and they're going to have questions for Victor before they come looking for anyone." He glanced up at the building facade. "You should make your calls somewhere that isn't here." "Right." She looked at the cab, looked back at him. "Come with me." "Miss Monroe." "Sophia." She said it firmly, like correcting a clerical error. "And I'm not asking you to be my bodyguard. I'm asking you to come somewhere safe and tell me what you've been seeing in that building for however long you've been watching it." She held his gaze. "Because you have been watching it. I could tell." He should have said no. He knew what saying yes meant. Not in any dramatic sense, but in the practical, mundane sense of a line crossed that didn't uncross. He'd spent 4 years on the correct side of that line. He'd built a whole life on it. He looked at the building again, thought about the rotated camera, the offline badge reader, the man with the equipment bag, the careful, even footsteps of someone who had done it before. "Okay," he said. They got in the cab. She took them to a hotel lobby 6 blocks north. Not her choice of destination, she explained. She just needed somewhere with people and Wi-Fi and a corner table, and the Meridian had all 3. They sat at a small table near the back of the lobby bar, and Sophia ordered 2 coffees without asking him and then looked at him expectantly. He told her what he'd seen. Not all of it. Not the part about listening from stairwells and calculating positions and running threat assessments on people whose names he didn't know. Just the facts. The camera, the badge reader, the 2 men, the equipment bag, the timeline. She listened without interrupting, which was not nothing. Most people interrupt. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, "The server room. You think they got the Helix files?" "I think they got something. Whether it was specifically Helix or something adjacent to it, it was Helix." She said it flatly, like a diagnosis. Priya, my internal auditor, traced the credential access. It was the core algorithm files. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Someone has the architecture for a medical AI that we've spent $40 million in 2 years building, and they have a VP of this company helping them leverage it. What does Crestline Analytics actually do? She looked at him. You heard that. I was cleaning the recycling station. Crestline doesn't exist, she said. Not in any real sense. It's a shell. Priya traced it through 3 holding companies to a private equity group called Harrow Capital, which has significant investment positions in 2 of our direct competitors. She paused. One of them is currently in FDA approval proceedings for a competing triage platform. Ethan absorbed that. So the money wasn't just payment for stolen files, it was Victor's cut for running the operation from inside. That's what I think. And the document they wanted you to sign today? Operational control transfer, temporary, on paper, permanent, in practice. She looked at her coffee. If I sign that, the board convenes, Victor presents himself as the stabilizing figure, and by the time anyone untangles the legal structure, the Helix IP is already integrated into a competitor's product and there's nothing to recover. Ethan said nothing for a moment. He was thinking about the men in the conference room, specifically the one near the windows, the one who'd been in the server room, the one with the economy of movement that came from real training. That man was not just a hired contractor. He'd seen that kind of competence before, and it cost more than corporate espionage usually allocated for physical security. Who else knows what you know? He said. Gerald, my CFO. Priya, my attorney, as of this morning. She looked up. Why? Because if Victor is connected to something that can put 3 trained men in a conference room on a Saturday, then the people around you who know what you know are also at some level of risk. He said it evenly, not to alarm her, just because it was true and she needed to know it. Not necessarily physical risk. Information risk. Pressure. Leverage. Things that make them less useful to you. She was quiet for a moment. You think there are more of them? I think what happened today was a compression of the timeline, and I think whoever is running this above Victor is aware that you haven't signed anything and that the window is closing. He picked up his coffee. What's your relationship with the board chair? Martin Lowe. He's been with the company since my father's era. I trust him. She paused. I think I trust him. Call him tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight. He set the cup down. And don't go back to your apartment alone. She looked at him steadily. Is that a professional recommendation or a personal one? Both. She looked at him for a long moment. There was something in her expression that he couldn't quite categorize. Not gratitude, not exactly, and not the assessment of an employer looking at a useful employee. It was more like the look of someone who has been carrying something alone for long enough that the simple presence of another person who knows the weight of it registers as something close to profound. You said your name was Ethan Cole, she said. That's right. Ethan Cole, who cleans floors 38 through 40. 14 months. And before that, it wasn't a question. He'd known this moment was coming from the second he walked into that conference room and put his shoulder into the first man's jaw. You couldn't do what he'd done in front of a witness and then pretend it hadn't happened. Before that, I was in the Navy, he said. Special operations. I separated in 2021. She nodded slowly, like she was placing a piece she'd already suspected. Why the building? Why this job? He thought about how to answer that. The honest answer was complicated and involved a classified mission and a daughter and a therapist who'd told him he wouldn't let her pass the second layer and a kitchen in the dark at 2 a.m. with a glass of water he didn't drink. He settled on the version that was true without being all of the truth. I have a daughter, he said. She's 9. I needed something that didn't follow me home. Sophia looked at him for a moment, not with pity, which he would have disliked, but with something quieter. Recognition, maybe. The expression of someone who also knows what it costs to keep one part of your life separate from the rest of it. Does it work? She said. He thought about that, about stairwells and rotated cameras and the weight that had pulled at the locked door in the back of his mind for 2 weeks. Most nights, he said. She nodded. She picked up her phone and pulled up a contact and held it out to show him. Martin Lowe, board chair, a mobile number. I'm going to make this call, she said, and then I'm going to need to figure out where I'm sleeping tonight that isn't my apartment. And then tomorrow morning, I'm going to need to figure out how to prove that Victor Hale has been systematically stealing from this company and tried to coerce me at gunpoint. Not gunpoint, Ethan said. They didn't draw on you. They were armed men in a locked room. Legally, that distinction matters. She stared at him. You're going to be pedantic right now. I'm going to be accurate. It'll matter when this goes to a prosecutor. She almost laughed. He could see it. It got most of the way there before her face remembered what afternoon this had been. She pressed her lips together instead and said, Okay, accurate. Fine. She dialed Martin Lowe. Ethan sat back and held his coffee and looked out at the lobby. A family was checking in near the front desk. 2 adults, a kid about Lily's age dragging a wheeled suitcase that was almost as tall as she was, looking around the hotel lobby with the open, unguarded expression of someone who has never had a reason to read a room. He watched her for a second. He was in it now. He knew that. The locked door in the back of his mind was open, and the thing inside it, the part of him that read angles and geometries and the weight distribution of people who were about to do something, was standing in the full light of it, and there was nothing to do about that except go forward. Across the table, Sophia Monroe was speaking quietly and urgently into her phone, one hand flat on the tabletop, her coffee going cold again. His knuckles ached. His shoulder ached. His knee, where it had caught the chair edge, was developing into a bruise he'd feel for a week. He was, he realized, more awake than he'd been in years. That was the part he hadn't expected. Not the adrenaline. He'd expected that, and discounted it as chemistry, as the residue of muscle memory. What he hadn't expected was the other thing underneath it, quieter and harder to name, the feeling of being exactly where the situation required, doing exactly what the situation demanded, without apology and without pretense. He hadn't felt that in 4 years. He wasn't sure what to do with it. He put it aside, where he put most things he didn't know what to do with, and waited for Sophia Monroe to finish her phone call. Martin Lowe arrived at the Meridian at 6:14 that evening. Ethan knew he was coming before Sophia finished describing him, because there were only so many ways a 70-year-old board chairman presents himself in a hotel lobby on a Saturday night when someone he trusts has told him there were armed men in a conference room that afternoon. Lowe came in through the revolving door, moving faster than his age suggested he should, wearing a wool overcoat he hadn't fully buttoned, his white hair slightly wind-displaced. He scanned the lobby in one sweep. Not the casual scan of someone looking for a familiar face, but the deliberate, practiced scan of someone who wanted to know what else was in the room before he found who he was looking for. Ethan liked him immediately, which was not a feeling he extended to many people quickly. Sophia stood up from the table and Lowe crossed to her and took both her hands in his, briefly, and said something low that Ethan didn't catch. Then he looked at Ethan. "This is Ethan Cole," Sophia said. "He works nights in the building, floors 38 through 40. Lowe looked at Ethan with the specific expression of a man who has just been told a thing that doesn't fully parse and is deciding whether to say so. He extended his hand. "Martin Lowe." "I know," Ethan said, and shook it. They sat down. Sophia walked Lowe through everything. The Crestline payments, the credential theft, the server room access, the document Victor had produced that afternoon. Lowe listened the way people listen when they are both surprised and not surprised, when a thing they half suspected has just been confirmed in worse terms than they anticipated. His face moved through several expressions without landing on any of them for long. When she described the conference room, the 3 men, the containment geometry, Victor standing at the head of the table, Lowe looked at Ethan again. "And you walked in," he said. "I had the wrong room," Ethan said. Sophia made a sound beside him that was not quite a laugh. Lowe looked between them. Something in his expression settled into something that might have been, under different circumstances, amusement. "Right," he said. "The wrong room." He sat back. "I've had concerns about Victor for about 8 months. Nothing concrete enough to bring to the full board. Mostly patterns. The way certain conversations would end when I entered a room. A proposal last spring for restructuring the executive authorization chain that I voted against, and that somehow kept coming back in slightly different forms. He shook his head. I should have pushed harder. You couldn't have known, Sophia said. No, but I could have pushed harder anyway. He looked at her directly. What do you need from me tonight? I need you to activate the emergency board protocol. I need an independent security sweep of the server room and a full audit hold on Victor's system access. Done. I'll make the calls from here. He paused. And Harrow Capital. You're certain about the connection? Priya has the documentation. 3 holding companies, then directly to Harrow. Their investment position in Avanon Medical is on public record. She reached into her portfolio and produced a folded printout. This is what she gave me this morning. Lowe unfolded it and read it with his reading glasses down his nose, one finger moving slightly along the text. When he finished, he folded it again carefully and put it in his overcoat pocket. This is enough, he said. Not for a conviction. That's the attorney's job. But enough to move the board tonight. He pulled out his phone and stood up and moved toward the quieter end of the lobby to make his calls. And Sophia sat back in her chair and exhaled slowly, the specific exhale of someone releasing a breath they'd been holding since 2 in the afternoon. He'll move on it, she said, not quite to Ethan, not quite to herself. I know, Ethan said. She looked at him. You keep saying that. I know. How do you always know? People tell you things before they say anything. The way Lowe came through that door, you were reading him before he reached the table. It's a habit. From the Navy. He didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. Sophia's attorney arranged a suite on the 14th floor of the Meridian under the firm's account, and she was checked in by 8 that evening with Gerald Park and Priya Nair both en route. Priya with a laptop and 3 external hard drives of documentation, Gerald with the expression of a man who has spent the day understanding that a bad situation is actually worse than it appeared, and is processing this with the grim, methodical calm of someone who has always suspected the world was unreliable. Ethan had planned to leave. He'd said so at 7:30, standing up from the lobby table, telling Sophia that she had Lowe and her attorney and Priya's documentation, and that the rest of it was process, legal, and administrative, the part where he was genuinely not useful. Sit down, she said. I have to call my daughter. Then call her and sit back down. He'd called Lily from the lobby, standing near a pillar, half turned from the room the way he'd stood in stairwells all those months. Lily had been in the middle of dinner. He could hear the specific quality of sound that meant Paulina's television was on in the adjacent room, and she told him about a drawing she'd done in art class, a bird in the middle of a storm, and the teacher had said it was striking, which Lily pronounced with great satisfaction. That's really good, Ethan said. She said striking, Dad. That's basically the best word. It is a good word. Are you coming home late? He looked across the lobby toward the table where Sophia was watching Lowe make his phone calls. Maybe a little late tonight, yeah. You okay with Paulina? We're watching The Crown. She keeps explaining who everyone is, even though I can read the subtitles. Be patient with her. I am patient. I'm very patient. I'm the most patient person in this apartment. Good night, Lily. Night, Dad. He went back to the table and sat down. Shotgun. At 9:47, Ethan's phone rang. He didn't recognize the number. Chicago area code, no contact. He looked at it for a second and then stepped away from the suite where Sophia and her team were working and took the call in the hallway. Mr. Cole? The voice was even, deliberate, male, probably late 40s, with the specific vocal quality of someone who has spent a long time projecting authority without volume. I think you've been busy today. Ethan said nothing. My name isn't important, the voice continued. What's important is that you understand the position you've put yourself in. You've assaulted 3 private security contractors. You've interfered with a legitimate business negotiation. And you've inserted yourself into a situation that has implications you haven't fully considered. Who gave you this number? Ethan said. You've been an employee of Monroe Dynamics for 14 months, Mr. Cole. HR records aren't difficult. Ethan stood in the hotel hallway and looked at the carpet pattern, a repeating geometric in gray and gold, and said nothing. I'm not calling to threaten you, the voice said, in the tone of someone who is absolutely calling to threaten him. I'm calling because I think you're a reasonable man who made a reactive choice this afternoon, and I want to give you the opportunity to step back from this before it becomes something you can't step back from. What does stepping back look like? It looks like a man who cleaned some floors, went home, and has no further involvement in internal corporate matters that don't concern him. A pause. It looks like a father who is home with his daughter, and not in a hotel lobby making himself a problem. Ethan's jaw tightened. He kept his breathing even. Say that second part again. Mr. Cole, the part about my daughter. Say it again so I'm clear on what you mean. Silence. Then, I'm simply observing that you have priorities outside this situation, and that prioritizing them would be the rational choice. Ethan took the phone away from his ear and looked at it for a moment. Then he put it back. I'm going to tell you one thing, and then this call is over. Whatever Victor Hale told you about his position, about how this ends, about what he can manage, he was wrong. He's been wrong about a lot of things in the last few weeks, and this is the last one that's going to cost him. He paused. Don't call this number again. He hung up. He stood in the hallway for 30 seconds. Then he called Paulina Grzeski. She answered on the third ring with the slightly irritated tone of someone pulled from an engrossing television scene. Yes, Ethan. Paulina, I need you to do something for me without asking why. A beat. She had never asked him much about his life, and he had never offered much. And in 14 months, this had produced a functional, quietly respectful arrangement between two people who understood that some things don't need to be explained. Okay, she said. Lock the front door and the deadbolt. Don't open it for anyone you don't know tonight. If anyone you don't know knocks or rings, call me immediately. Another beat. Is Lily in danger? No, I'm being careful. There's a difference between careful and scared, Paulina said. Which one are you? He thought about that. Both, he said. Lock the door. Already walking, he heard her footsteps, the specific sound of Paulina's slippered shuffle on hardwood, then the slide and click of the deadbolt. Done. Lily is eating applesauce and watching something about penguins. She is fine. Thank you, Paulina. Come home, she said, and hung up. He went back into the suite and found Sophia alone. Priya had stepped into the bedroom with the hard drives. Gerald was on a call in the corner. Lowe had left an hour earlier to convene a board emergency session. Sophia looked at his face and said, What happened? It wasn't a question. Someone called me. I don't know who. Someone above Victor in the chain. He sat down across from her at the suite's small dining table. They mentioned Lily. Her expression changed. Your daughter. Implied, not direct, but clear enough. She was quiet for a moment. Her hands were flat on the table and she was looking at them. Then she looked up. I'm sorry. This is because of me, because you... Don't, he said. Ethan, don't apologize for Victor Hale and whoever is running him. That's not yours to carry. He said it more firmly than he'd intended and then softened it slightly. You didn't put armed men in your own conference room. She looked at him steadily. Then, is she safe? For now. Paulina, the neighbor watching her, has the door locked. I'll check again in an hour. He paused. But I need this to move faster. Whatever Victor has planned, whatever Harrow Capital's contingency is when they realize the board is moving against them, I think we're inside a short window. Priya thinks there's a secondary archive. Sophia said it carefully, the way you say something you've been sitting with and are still deciding whether to believe. She found a reference in one of the email chains. Victor mentioned something called a deletion protocol to an external address. She thinks it might be a remote wipe trigger for the evidence trail. Can she trace the external address? She's trying, but if Victor activates it from anywhere outside the building, the documentation disappears. Ethan thought about that. Where would the archive be? Physical or digital? Both, potentially. Victor has an office on 39 and a secondary workspace on 22 that he uses for off-the-books meetings. Priya found badge access logs showing he spent 3 hours on 22 the Thursday before last, well after normal hours. Ethan knew floor 22. He'd cleaned it twice, covering for a coworker, before his regular assignment was established. It was a partially developed floor. Build-out had stalled 18 months ago when a planned expansion was shelved. Drop ceilings still exposed in sections. A cluster of semi-finished offices, two of them locked, that nobody used. He'd noted the locked offices both times he'd been there, filed it, and moved on, because filing things and moving on was what he did. "I know that floor," he said. Sophia looked at him. "Of course you do. I'd need to get into the building without triggering a flag on my badge. After what happened today, Victor will have people watching access logs. I can issue a temporary override through the facilities management system. Martin already suspended Victor's credentials, but mine are still clean." She reached for her laptop. "Give me 10 minutes. Sophia." He waited until she looked up. "If Victor activates the deletion protocol before we get into that room, the case the board is building, I know what it means." She said it the way she'd said other hard things over the course of this very long day, directly, without flinching, in the specific manner of someone who does not find it easier to look away. "So let's not let him activate it." He went back to the building alone. That was not what Sophia had wanted, and they'd had a brief functional argument about it in the suite hallway at 10:50 that ended with Ethan saying, "If I'm not back in 90 minutes, send Priya's documentation to every board member and every attorney on your contact list and call the FBI." And Sophia saying, "That is not a reassuring plan," and Ethan saying, "I know," and leaving. The building was quieter than it had been that afternoon, obviously, but not empty. The Saturday night security rotation had two guards on the lobby desk, both of them new faces to Ethan, which was either coincidence or not, and the upper floors had whatever remained of the normal evening presence. He badged in using the temporary override Sophia had issued, which routed his entry through the facilities management channel and logged him as maintenance response to an HVAC alert, which Priya had created as a cover, which was the kind of lie that works precisely because it is too boring to question. He took the service elevator to 22 and stepped out into the half-lit quiet of an unfinished floor. Drop ceilings with exposed sections above, raw concrete in the corridor that connected the finished offices to the construction shell. Two overhead fluorescents working, a third flickering. The smell of old drywall and the particular dryness of a space nobody had breathed in for a while. He moved to the east cluster. Two finished offices behind a secondary door that required a physical key, not a badge. The lock was a standard commercial deadbolt, relatively new, which told him Victor had installed it himself or had it installed, which in a corporate building meant off-book. He looked at the lock. He was not going to pretend he had a lockpick set. He didn't have a lockpick set. He had a flathead screwdriver from the toolkit on his maintenance cart, a credit card that was not going to work on a deadbolt, and the knowledge that the door frame on this floor was unfinished drywall over a metal stud, which meant the strike plate was held by screws going into drywall rather than into a solid wood frame, which meant that with enough lateral pressure applied to the right point on the door edge. It took him 4 tries and cost him the skin on the heel of his hand, but the strike plate pulled through the drywall on the 4th attempt and the door swung inward. He stepped inside. The office was dark. He used his phone light, a folding table, 2 chairs, a portable document safe pushed against the far wall, and on the table a laptop connected to an external drive with a cable that was still plugged into the wall outlet, which meant it had been left in a state ready to be used quickly, which meant Victor had planned to come back to it. He looked at the portable safe. Combination lock. He had no idea what the combination was and no time to develop one. He picked up the laptop. The screen came alive when he opened it. Not locked, just sleeping, which told him Victor hadn't anticipated anyone finding this room tonight. On the screen, an open file directory, dozens of folders, named in the truncated coded format that people use when they're organizing things they don't want labeled clearly. He found one called HA Final, Harrow Avanon was his guess, and opened it. Inside, a copy of the Helix Core algorithm files, a series of email threads between an address he didn't recognize and one that ended in a Harrow Capital domain. Wire transfer confirmations for amounts that made the Crestline payments look like petty cash. And at the bottom of the file tree, a folder labeled CE Personnel that contained, he opened it, files on 6 Monroe Dynamics employees. Their names, personal information, what looked like financial pressure points. Gerald Park had a son in expensive private school. Priya Nair had a brother who'd had legal trouble 3 years ago. 2 engineers on the Helix team had mortgages that were slightly underwater. Victor had been building leverage on everyone around Sophia for when the time came. The last file in the folder was labeled EC. Ethan opened it. It took him a moment to understand what he was looking at, and then he understood, and he sat down in one of the folding chairs in the dark of the unfinished office and read it. Garcin. The file on Ethan Cole was not a financial profile. Victor had clearly determined, or been told, that Ethan's financial situation offered no useful leverage. He had almost nothing, which meant almost nothing to lose in that direction. The file was something else. It was a dossier on Operation Cleave, dated 2019. Classified, or it had been. Someone had gotten hold of a version of the after-action summary, redacted in places but clear enough in its essential narrative. A 6-man SEAL team operating in a coastal sector that the document declined to name. A target that was described only as a high-value asset with ties to a foreign intelligence network. And the outcome? Mission compromised, partial extraction, 3 civilian casualties in the surrounding structure that had not been identified as occupied in the pre-mission intelligence. Ethan had known the intelligence was wrong. He'd flagged it. In the pre-op briefing, sitting in a metal chair in a room that smelled like diesel and institutional coffee, he'd said to the officer running the mission that the occupancy assessment on the adjacent structure was wrong, that there were signs of habitation they hadn't accounted for, and the officer had looked at him and said, "We're on a timeline, Cole." And he had said, "I understand the timeline, sir. I'm telling you the intelligence is wrong," and the officer had said they were proceeding. 3 people died in that structure. A woman and 2 children whose names he had eventually found through a chain of effort he'd rather not detail. He had never fully stopped knowing their names. He thought about them at odd hours, in stairwells, in kitchens in the dark, in the specific minutes before sleep that are the hardest to control. He had not failed the mission. He'd completed it. The target was secured. But he had been carrying the weight of those names in a room where nobody would ever let him explain the full context, because the full context was classified, and classified meant it didn't exist in any form where explaining it would matter. The dossier Victor had compiled distorted this cleanly. It described a SEAL who had raised objections during a critical operation, causing hesitation that led to compromised timing and civilian harm. It described a soldier who had been quietly separated from the service following a review process that the document implied, without stating outright, was disciplinary. The separation had not been disciplinary. He'd left because he couldn't reconcile what had happened with continuing, and because Lily was 6 years old and needed a father who was present in more than just body. He'd chosen to go. That choice had been his. Victor had taken that choice and made it look like removal. Ethan sat in the dark with the laptop screen casting pale light on his face and looked at the file for a long time. He thought about anger. He checked for it the way you check a wound, carefully, trying to be honest about what's there. The anger was present. It wasn't the hot kind. It was the older, heavier kind that doesn't burn so much as press down, and he had enough practice with it by now to recognize that it was not the thing that should drive the next decision. The next decision was simple. The file on the laptop was evidence. The email threads and the wire transfers and the Helix files were evidence. He needed to get this to Sophia and Priya without Victor knowing the room had been found, which meant he needed to copy it without taking the physical laptop, which would immediately signal the breach. He pulled out his phone. He connected it to the laptop using the cable that was already plugged into the wall. The other end was standard USB, and copied the entire file directory to his phone's storage. It took 11 minutes. He sat in the dark and watched the progress bar and breathed. When it finished, he unplugged the cable and restored it to its original position. He closed the laptop back to its sleeping state. He stood up and looked around the room to make sure everything was as he'd found it. His hand was bleeding slightly from where the door frame had taken the skin off his heel. He wrapped it in a piece of paper from his pocket, which was not ideal, but was what he had. He left the room. The doorframe was visibly damaged, the strike plate bulging through the drywall, and there was nothing to be done about that. Victor would know someone had been here when he came back. The question was whether they'd have what they needed before that mattered. He took the service elevator down, badged out through the facilities channel, and walked 2 blocks north before he called Sophia. She picked up before the first ring finished. "Are you out?" "I'm out. I have everything." A pause. Everything. Helix files, Harrow correspondence, wire transfers, and something else. He stopped on the sidewalk. The Chicago night was cold and clear, the wind off the lake finding the gaps in his jacket. Victor put a file together on me. My military background, a version of a classified operation I was part of. A longer pause. What kind of version? The kind that makes me look like a liability, something he could use to discredit me if I became a problem. He heard her exhale. "Ethan, it doesn't change the evidence. The other files are clean and complete. Whatever he built on me is a distortion, not a refutation." "I know that." She said it without hesitation, which he hadn't expected and which landed somewhere it took him a second to locate. "How bad is the distortion?" He stood on the sidewalk in the cold and looked at the building he'd just come out of. His building, technically, the place he'd spent 14 months being nobody, and thought about how to answer that. "It'll be uncomfortable," he said, "when it comes out." "Will it be true?" "Parts of it." "Then we deal with the parts that are true, and we correct the parts that aren't." Her voice was steady. Not reassuring in a performed way, just steady in the way that some people are steady when things are falling apart. Not because they're unaffected, but because steadiness is a choice they're making in real time. "Get back here. Priya needs to see what's on your phone." He started walking. "Sophia." "Yeah." "The file he built on me. There are things in it I've never told anyone." He said it carefully, because he was being careful, because this was the edge of something he didn't step over easily. "About what happened, about what I should have done differently." She was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to tell me anything," she said. "Not tonight. Not ever, if you don't want to." "I know." He turned up his collar against the wind. "I just wanted you to know it exists before you see it." Another pause, shorter this time. "I appreciate that." He walked the 2 blocks back to the Meridian without saying anything else, and she stayed on the line without saying anything else. And the wind came in off the lake, and the city moved around him, and his hand ached where the doorframe had taken the skin, and the file on his phone contained the evidence that would decide the next several months of a lot of people's lives. He thought about Lily, the drawing of a bird in a storm, the teacher who had called it striking, the satisfaction in her voice when she said the word. He thought about what it costs to carry something alone for long enough that you forget what it would feel like to put it down. The Meridian lobby doors slid open in front of him, warm air meeting cold, and he went inside. Priya Nair worked through the night. That was the only way to describe it. Not efficiently, not brilliantly, just through it. The way you move through bad weather, one step at a time, head down. She took the files from Ethan's phone and spent 4 hours cross-referencing them against the documentation she'd already compiled, building the kind of evidentiary architecture that doesn't leave gaps for a defense attorney to walk through. Gerald sat across from her at the suite's dining table, drinking coffee that had long since gone cold, running parallel verification on the wire transfers. And the two of them worked in the specific silence of people who understand that what they're doing matters, and that talking about it would only slow them down. Ethan sat near the window and watched the city and said very little. Sophia moved between the table and the phone, talking to her attorney in the intervals between Priya's updates, building the filing sequence that would need to happen in a specific order when morning came. At 2 a.m., she brought Ethan a sandwich from the hotel menu that he hadn't asked for, set it on the windowsill beside him without comment, and went back to the table. He ate half of it. She noticed and didn't say anything, which was the right call. At 3:40, Priya leaned back in her chair and said, "Okay, we have it." Nobody cheered. Gerald took his glasses off and rubbed his eyes. Sophia stood up from the couch where she'd been reviewing documents and crossed to the table and looked at what Priya had assembled. The full chain, visible now from the first Crestline payment through to the Harrow Capital connection, to the wire transfers, and the copied Helix files and the email threads that showed Victor coordinating the extraction with full knowledge of what he was doing and why. "This is enough," Sophia said. "It's more than enough," Priya said. The email threads alone are a federal wire fraud case. The IP theft adds another layer, and the personnel files, she paused. The leverage files. Those establish premeditation and scope. This wasn't opportunistic. He planned it. Sophia looked at the screen for a long moment. Then she looked at Ethan. The file on you is in here. I know. We're going to have to disclose it as part of the package. The attorneys will want to present the full picture of what Victor was doing, including the intimidation materials. She said it directly, not apologetically. She'd figured out that he preferred directness, or maybe she'd always preferred it herself and was just extending the same courtesy she'd want. That means people will see it. I know, he said again, and you're okay with that. He considered the question honestly. The answer was complicated in the way that most true answers are. He was not okay with it in the sense that it was comfortable or easy. He was okay with it in the sense that he'd made his peace, somewhere between floor 22 and the Meridian lobby, with the fact that some things that have been buried eventually surface regardless of how carefully you've covered them, and that the only variable is whether they surface on your terms or someone else's. Let's just finish it, he said. The FBI's Chicago field office received the filing package at 8:17 on Sunday morning, routed through Sophia's attorney with a simultaneous submission to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Martin Lowe had spent the night convening an emergency board session by phone. 7 members reached, 6 in agreement, 1 abstention from a member who had 2 calls with Victor Hale on record in the previous month and had the sense to recuse himself rather than compound the problem. Victor Hale's credentials were suspended at 6 a.m. When he attempted to badge into the Monroe Dynamics building at 8:50, walking in through the main lobby in his good suit, presumably to access the floor 22 office before anyone else got there, the badge reader gave him a red light and building security met him at the turnstile. He said very little. He made a phone call in the lobby that security observed but couldn't hear. He left. He was arrested at his apartment at 11:14 that morning. Ethan was not there for any of this. He was home. He'd left the Meridian at 5:30 after the filing was confirmed and Priya had backed up everything to 3 separate encrypted locations, and Gerald had finally fallen asleep on the sweet couch with his glasses still on. Sophia had walked him to the elevator, which he hadn't expected. "You should sleep," he said. "I will." She didn't look like someone who was going to sleep anytime soon. She looked like someone running on something beyond tiredness, past the second or third wall, in the territory where your body has simply agreed to keep going because stopping isn't an option yet. "Ethan," he waited. "What you did yesterday." She stopped, started differently. "I've had security consultants. I've had people whose entire job was to assess risk and manage threats. And not one of them would have done what you did. Gone in alone with a beverage cart," he said. "Stop deflecting." He looked at her. The elevator was there. He'd hit the button and it had arrived and the doors were open. He stood there anyway. "I didn't do it because it was my job," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm a janitor. It wasn't my job." "I know that. I did it because—" He stopped. Because what? Because he'd listened to her voice go quiet in Victor Hale's office and recognized the specific sound of someone refusing to give up a thing they'd built at significant personal cost. And something in that had reached past the 4 years of careful distance he'd constructed and pulled at something he thought he'd buried. Because he'd spent a long time making himself into nobody and had found out, on a Saturday afternoon in a conference room, that nobody wasn't something you could actually become, no matter how long you practiced it. He didn't say any of that. He said, "Because it was the right thing to do. And I hadn't done the right thing in a while." She looked at him for a moment, then she said, "Thank you." And she meant it the way that some people mean things. Not as a social grace, but as an actual transfer of something real from one person to another. The elevator doors started to close. He caught them with his hand. "Get some sleep, Sophia. Go home to your daughter, Ethan." He went home to his daughter. Lily was still asleep when he got there. 6:10 in the morning, gray light at the windows, Paulina's apartment silent next door. He stood in the doorway of Lily's room for a while. She was on her back with one arm thrown out and her mouth slightly open and her hair everywhere, completely unconscious in the way that children sleep when they feel safe. That total, unguarded surrender to it, and something in his chest did a thing it did sometimes when he looked at her and he let it, because he was tired and his hand was wrapped in an improvised bandage, and he'd had about 4 hours of sleep in the last 30, and there was a limit to how much you could hold back at any given moment. He went to the kitchen and made coffee and sat at the table and waited for morning. He was still sitting there when Lily came out at 7:45 in her pajamas with her hair doing 3 contradictory things and squinted at him. "You're home." "I'm home." She registered his wrapped hand. "What happened to your hand?" "Caught it on something at work." She came over and looked at it with the frank, unsentimental interest of a 9-year-old assessing an injury. "Does it need a Band-Aid?" "It's okay. It should have a Band-Aid." She went to the bathroom and came back with the Band-Aid box. The ones with the cartoon dinosaurs on them that she'd picked out herself and that he'd long since stopped trying to replace with plain ones. And she sat down across from him and redressed the heel of his hand with the focused, slightly frowning concentration she brought to things she decided to take seriously. He sat very still and let her. "Dad," she said, without looking up. "Yeah." "Were you doing something dangerous last night?" He thought about that, about how much truth was the right amount of truth for a 9-year-old at 7:45 on a Sunday morning. "A little bit," he said. "It's over now." She put the last piece of tape on the bandage and looked up. She had gray eyes, like his. The one thing people consistently said she'd gotten from him, which he found quietly meaningful in ways he'd never tried to articulate. She looked at him with those eyes and said, "Were you the kind of dangerous that helps someone, or the kind that's just dumb?" He almost laughed. The laugh got most of the way there. "The first kind," he said. "I think." She considered this. Then she nodded, apparently satisfied with the distinction, and said, "Okay, can we have pancakes?" "Yeah," he said. "We can have pancakes." The weeks that followed were not clean or simple, which is what weeks following significant events rarely are, regardless of how the story resolves in its broad strokes. The FBI investigation moved at the pace federal investigations move, which is to say it moved, but not quickly. And the process of it required depositions and document reviews and a series of meetings between Sophia's legal team and prosecutors that consumed most of November. Ethan gave a deposition on a Tuesday in a conference room that smelled like stale air and printer toner. 2 federal agents and a prosecutor, a court reporter with a machine that made a specific quiet sound with every keystroke. He answered questions for 2 hours and 40 minutes. He was accurate. He was specific. He did not editorialize. When the prosecutor asked about the conference room on the 39th floor, the 3 men, the sequence of events, what he'd used and how, Ethan described it factually, without framing it as either heroism or exceptional circumstance. He'd had training. He'd seen an immediate threat to a person in danger. He'd intervened. The prosecutor wrote something down. The EC file, Victor's dossier on Ethan, came up near the end. The prosecutor had clearly read it and was clearly trying to determine whether it constituted a problem for their case. "The file characterizes your separation from the Navy as disciplinary," the prosecutor said. "Was it?" "No," Ethan said. "Can you clarify the actual circumstances?" He could. He did. He described the pre-op briefing, the concern he'd raised, the decision to proceed, the outcome. He described it without the weight he usually carried it with. Not because the weight wasn't there, but because a deposition is not the right container for that kind of weight, and he'd learned over the years to put things in the right containers. When he finished, the prosecutor was quiet for a moment, then, "The file implies your objection caused hesitation that contributed to the adverse outcome." "That's incorrect. The timeline was already compromised by the intelligence failure, not by my objection." The after-action review concluded the same thing. He paused. "The full review, not the version in the file." "Is the full review available?" "Parts of it were declassified in 2022. My attorney has the relevant sections." The prosecutor made another note. One of the federal agents looked at Ethan with the expression of someone recalibrating something they'd assumed coming in. Ethan looked back at them without particular expression. Outside the conference room window, Chicago was gray and cold and getting on with its November. Victor Hale was indicted on 11 counts in December, including wire fraud, theft of trade secrets, conspiracy, and obstruction. Two executives at Harrow Capital were indicted on related charges the following week. The man who had called Ethan's phone on the night of the hotel, the voice that had mentioned Lily with that particular careful implication, was identified as a senior Harrow operative named Douglas Krause, who had apparently believed, incorrectly, that a phone call from an unknown number was more untraceable than it turned out to be. He was indicted in January. The Helix project survived. The copied files had been partially integrated into the competing platform's development, but Priya's documentation established the theft timeline clearly enough that Avanon Medical's FDA proceedings were suspended pending investigation. Monroe Dynamics' legal team filed a civil suit that would take years to resolve, but was, by all attorney assessments, a strong case. Monroe Dynamics itself went through a difficult quarter. The story became public in pieces. A financial press item in November, a longer investigative piece in December that ran in a national business publication and named names and described the conference room confrontation in terms that Ethan found both accurate in their facts and slightly operatic in their framing. He read it once and put it away. Sophia gave one interview to a reporter she trusted in which she described the events plainly and credited the documentation work of her finance and audit teams and said nothing specific about the Saturday afternoon in the conference suite that hadn't already been established in court filings. She was deliberate about this. She said later, when Ethan asked her about it, that she hadn't wanted to make the story about a single moment rather than about the 2 years of work that Victor had been systematically undermining, which was where the real damage had been done and where the real recovery would have to happen. He thought that was right. He thought it also took a specific kind of discipline to tell a story about yourself in a way that doesn't center the most dramatic moment, and that this discipline was not unrelated to the one that had kept her standing in that conference room with her weight slightly forward, refusing to sign. But she offered him the job in February, not in a formal setting, not in a meeting with HR and a compensation package on the table. She called him on a Tuesday evening when he was in the middle of making Lily's lunch for the next day, and she said, "I want to talk to you about something. Are you free tomorrow morning?" They met at a coffee place near the building, not the building itself, which Ethan had not been back to since December, his employment technically in a kind of administrative suspension while the investigation ran its course. The coffee place was small and loud enough that the ambient noise provided privacy without requiring anyone to lower their voice. Sophia got there before him. She had coffee waiting, which he noticed and chose not to comment on. "Head of corporate security," she said, after the preliminary 3 minutes that two people who've been through something together sometimes need before they can get to the actual thing. "The role doesn't currently exist. I'd be creating it, which means you'd have significant input into what it looks like." Ethan wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "Sophia, let me finish." She wasn't being aggressive about it. She just had a thing she'd decided to say and wanted to say it completely. The building has a standard contracted security service that is adequate for normal operations and completely useless for anything that requires actual judgment. What happened in October existed in the gap between what I had and what I needed, and I'm not interested in being in that gap again. She paused. "Also, and this is separate, you can weigh it however you want, I think you've been spending 4 years trying to make yourself into someone smaller than you are, and I think it's been costing you something." He looked at her. "I could be wrong," she said. "You can tell me I'm wrong." He thought about the kitchen in the dark, the glass of water he didn't drink, the locked door in the back of his mind and the thing behind it that had been pulling at it for a long time before it finally got out. He thought about the stairwells and the rotated camera and the specific, hollow weight of watching something happen from a careful distance and telling himself it wasn't his problem. "You're not wrong," he said. She nodded. She picked up her coffee. "So, I haven't done anything like that job in 5 years. I know. I'm rusty in ways I can't fully assess until I'm actually doing it. I know that too. I'm not hiring you because I think you're a finished product. I'm hiring you because I think your judgment is sound, and you actually care about the thing you're protecting, which is rarer than the resume usually indicates. He was quiet for a moment. He watched a couple at the next table negotiating, apparently, over who was going to go back to the counter to get napkins. A completely ordinary argument, the kind that happens 1,000 times a day in 1,000 coffee places, entirely unrelated to anything. He found it briefly clarifying. Lily starts 5th grade in September, he said. Okay. The hours would have to be, I can't do nights. I can't do anything that makes me unavailable if she needs me. The role is days, standard executive hours with some flexibility around threat assessments. We can put a specific availability clause in the contract. He thought about it. He'd been thinking about it, if he was being honest, since the elevator at the Meridian, maybe since the parking level outside the building on a gray Saturday afternoon when she'd looked at him and said, "Who are you?" and meant it differently than anyone had asked him that in a long time. Yeah, he said. Okay. She looked at him, something in her expression, not triumphant, not relieved, just settled, the look of a thing that has found the shape it was supposed to have. Yeah? Yeah. She picked up her coffee. He picked up his. Outside the window, Chicago in February was doing what Chicago in February does, which is to say it was extremely cold and completely unbothered by this fact. One thing, he said. What? The cart. The one with the broken wheel. Someone needs to fix that. It's been broken since October. She stared at him, then she laughed. A real one, not polished, a little surprised at itself, the kind of laugh that means something caught you off guard and you let it. I will personally submit the maintenance request. I've submitted it twice. Then I'll submit it a third time and include the CEO's name and see what happens. That would be appreciated, he said. He went back to the building on a Monday in March. Not in the uniform. That was the thing that hit him first when he walked in through the main lobby in the morning. In the actual morning, with actual people, the lobby full of the particular noise of a workday beginning. That he wasn't in the uniform, wasn't heading to the service elevator, wasn't bracing for the long quiet of empty corridors. He badged in through the executive turnstile. The badge was new, a different color from the maintenance credentials, a different clearance level. His name on it. His photo. He took the main elevator to 39. The corridor looked different in the daytime. Obviously, it looked different in the daytime. He'd known that rationally, but knowing it and experiencing it were separate things. The same marble floor, the same glass partitions, the same overhead light, but full of people now. Actual people moving through it with coffee cups and laptops and the ordinary urgency of a Monday morning. Someone nodded to him near the elevator bay, the automatic nod of colleagues in a hallway, and he nodded back, and it took him a second to understand why that small thing registered the way it did. Nobody had nodded to him in this hallway before. He'd been the person they nodded through. He found the office Sophia had arranged, a real office, not large, a window facing east, a desk that was clearly from a supply catalog, but was functional. On the desk was a handwritten note from Priya that said, "Welcome." And also we need to talk about the badge access protocols on 22 because they are a disaster, which was so thoroughly Priya that he stood there and read it twice. He sat down at the desk. He sat there for a few minutes, not doing anything in particular, just sitting in an office, in the morning, on a Monday, in a building where people knew his name. The east window gave him a view of the street below. Taxis, a delivery truck double parked, two people having a conversation on the corner that looked effortful, a kid on a bike threading through the gap between the truck and the curb with the absolute confidence of someone who has done it 100 times. He thought about what Sophia had said in the coffee place. I think you've been spending 4 years trying to make yourself into someone smaller than you are. He'd turned that sentence over a lot in the weeks since, holding it up against different lights to see if it was true in the way she'd meant it or true in some other way that would change the meaning. What he'd come to, imperfectly and without complete certainty, because nothing about this kind of thing comes with complete certainty, was that she was right, and that she was also only partly right. He hadn't just been making himself smaller. He'd been keeping himself away from things that cost too much, which is a reasonable response to having paid too much and still not gotten the outcome you were hoping for. The mission that didn't go the way it should have, the 3 names he still carried, the choices that looked different in hindsight than they had in real time, and the particular cruelty of knowing that better intelligence would have changed everything and that you can't go back and supply the better intelligence. He'd been protecting Lily, yes, but he'd also been protecting himself, which was more complicated to admit and less flattering and true. The thing he'd learned in stairwells and conference rooms and hotel lobbies and a folding chair in a dark office on the 22nd floor with a file open on his lap that laid out his worst moment in someone else's distorted terms was that you don't get to finish grieving a thing by putting distance between yourself and everything that reminds you of it. The distance just preserves it, keeps it exactly as heavy as the day you put it down. He didn't know what it meant to actually finish carrying something. He was 37 years old, and he wasn't sure he'd figure that out anytime soon. But he thought it probably involved being in the world rather than at the edge of it. It involved doing things that mattered and accepting the cost of that. It involved Lily asking him at 7:45 in the morning whether he'd been the kind of dangerous that helped someone, and him being able to say yes, I think so, and meaning it. His phone buzzed. A text from Lily, sent from school before first period. Did you start the new job today? He typed back, just sat down at the desk. 3 seconds. Then, how is it? He looked around the office, the catalog desk, the east window. Priya's note. The Monday morning noise of a building full of people doing their ordinary consequential work. Good, he typed. It's good. There's something people get wrong about second chances, which is that they think a second chance means the first chance didn't count. Like the whole point is to erase the record and start clean and pretend the previous version of things didn't happen. It doesn't work that way. Ethan Cole was still the man who'd been in that pre-op briefing, who'd said the intelligence was wrong and been overruled, who'd carried 3 names for 5 years. He was still the man who'd turned himself into a night shift janitor because he needed something that didn't follow him home, and because he was, whatever else was true, afraid of what he'd been, of what it had cost, of what it might cost again. He was still a single father with a 9-year-old daughter who picked dinosaur Band-Aids and drew birds and storms and said striking with the satisfaction of someone who has found exactly the right word. None of that was erased. None of it was supposed to be. What changed was smaller and harder to articulate, which is usually the sign that it's the real thing. What changed was that he stopped treating his past like a wound that defined him and started treating it like a history that informed him. Not the same thing. The first one makes you smaller over time. The second one, if you let it, makes you useful. Sophia Monroe had lost something too in the years before October. Not the same thing. Her losses were different in shape. The specific kind of damage that comes from building something and watching it be quietly dismantled from the inside by someone you thought you could trust. She'd rebuilt the company once already when she took it over from her father. She was rebuilding it again, and this time she knew more about the places where it could break. She was not the person who walked past a janitor in the hallway without seeing him. She'd been that person, and she'd had reason to be. Not malice, just the specific narrowness of focus that comes from running a company in crisis, where everything beyond the immediate problem tends to blur. She'd seen him when it mattered. She was trying, imperfectly and without any guarantee of success, to be someone who kept seeing the people in the room. They were both, in their different ways, figuring out how to be people who'd had hard things happen to them without letting the hard things become the whole story. That's not a lesson with a clean edge. It doesn't resolve into a single sentence you can carry. It's more like a practice, something you do imperfectly and keep doing, in kitchens in the dark and stairwells and coffee places in February and offices with east-facing windows on a Monday morning in March. Ethan Cole sat at his desk in the building where he used to clean floors, and the city moved outside the window, and down the hall someone was laughing at something, and his hand had mostly healed, and his daughter was in school drawing things that teachers called striking, and the door that had been locked in the back of his mind for 5 years was open. He wasn't sure what to do with everything inside it. He was going to find out. That was enough. Most days, that was exactly enough.